how we think about body, and that is very much at the center of how we also think about sport. I mean, the question of body itself. But I, because this paper, I mean, I had, a lot of thoughts, and I was trying to put them together, especially with so much that's been said about cricket and Marxism particularly. How I've thought about this conversation is that, of sort of breaking it into three different stories or accounts. And where I will begin with is really this moment in this film, Another Country, which is adapted from a play, from the play of the same name, in which Colin Firth, the English actor, is this Marxist in an English public school, and has this disdain for all of its ways, but cannot translate that disdain for cricket. Cricket is for him is this pure space, and he tries to make sense of it through his politics as a Marxist, which was interesting because actually, I mean, that brings into conflict the very essence of something else that is where, then when we think about relationship between Marxism and cricket, some other literature that is at the heart of it, which is, of course, C.L.R. James's contribution about Beyond a Boundary. So before I come to Azhar, I sort of want to give, a background about why certain Marxists have actually found cricket to be a very useful, subject of study. And really, C.L.R. James's book Beyond a Boundary is the foundational text, if you think about it. One of the major contributions that that text makes is this argument for an aesthetic appreciation of cricket in this chapter, What is Art? James was very keen to disrupt the understanding or the hierarchy rather between high and low art, and he did that in these sort of multiple stages. So I'll break that down. First of all, he really he discussed Greek drama and the many instances of the confrontation between between two individuals, but also individuals as a representative of a wider social whole. And he equated that to cricket, because in cricket you find conflicts that go on simultaneously. One of them is obviously between the batsman and the bowler, but then it's also the two teams are in conflict with each other. The other sort of major preoccupation for James was especially thinking about the form of the and the sort of the kinetic movement that we see of the form of the human body. And this is interesting because he contrasts this with the classic sort of notions or artistic notions of painting. Why these two things come to matter is because what he's saying is that this confrontation is happening in a dialectic fashion between players, but also the appreciation and the critical appreciation that is coming on the field has a value of art, or has an artistic value, because of how the spectators see them. So he's disrupting that distinction between high and low art by thinking about what about popular appreciation, and how people actually, how fans and how spectators appreciate cricket. And he gives this example of actually it's not just movement, but also a sensory perception of it. And I think that takes us to the heart of of the aesthetic claims that James is making on account of cricket. Because if we go to the origin of or the etymology of the word aesthetic, so that the Greek word aesthetikos, which it invokes a corporeal sensorium. In Susan Buckmore's says words, it's perception by feeling is at the heart of it. And this sensory perception, in Terry Eagleton words, in this context, is born as a discourse of body. So to sort of simplify this, when we look at cricket and when we appreciate the sport, we speak of the five senses. Batsmen often speak of, for example, in the perfume ball in cricket. You see that and the perfume ball is actually something that travels past your nose. So that evokes a sensory perception of smell. But there are other sensory perceptions that that one could bring up in terms of sight, and in terms of also the sounds that you hear, and especially cricketers themselves, but also fans do that. For James, it was this word style which evoked an aesthetic perception as well. So so there so just to sort of back up and think about it. So James in his work is making these aesthetic claims on account of cricket, but in my view, and this is something that I get into the paper, is that there's more to be said. So one of the things that I go on and say in this paper is that there is a at the heart of cricket and at the heart of even understanding the sport, we have to think about the man's relationship with nature, and how much does the sport sort of change, especially for the sport, the way it's played changes over days on account of the weather. It depends on and I mean, you have to sort of appreciate the fact that the game can change depending on what is happening above in the sky, but also on the surface, and in that sense it's a very rare sport. And I guess you could make more aesthetic claims as opposed to other sports, although because in cricket particularly, you are thinking about what is happening above from the sky in terms of the natural elements and how they come to modify the game. So that is one way in which we can move beyond James. But you can also think about how this dialectical mode of contest, which I spoke about earlier, in which it's not just a simultaneous contest between two individuals and their teams and communities, but you're also sort of playing the surface, the playing surface and the conditions above and you're also negotiating different spatial dimensions. And I think, like, especially I'm spending a bit of time on this, is because if you're not familiar with cricket, it can become hard to understand that the spatial dimensions of the field do change. So there are multiple ways in which you can think about these sort of a variety of almost contradictory factors that come into play in terms of appreciating the game. And that's why I think Marxists, and it is not true only of James, but you can think of the American Marxist Mike Marcuse, who talks about who moved to England and who became a lifelong cricket fan, wrote actually plenty of sort of this Marxist sort of political economic critiques of cricket as well. So, and I think that's where the productive tension lies, because of the many factors that you can see. But at this point in the paper, I actually move on to sort of make the major claim which got me interested in Azhar, which is that in generally, and this is sort of field in which I've worked over the years, and I've seen that generally we only make political claims on behalf of sports persons by studying their political positions and the statements they take. But I think it becomes, because of the variety of aesthetic claims that you can make on behalf of of cricketers and cricket itself, sorry, you can think about the praxis and the way they approach the game itself. And I think here I would like to sort of flesh this out, because this is in my sense like a missed opportunity for CLR James, because CLR James spends a lot of time talking about certain individuals and the role those individuals are symbolized in terms of their relationship to society. But he does spend some time on the way they played the game, but why does that matter politically is, I think, worth sort of fleshing out. And there are some examples of it. So we can, Charles Lemert, the American sociologist, in work on Muhammad Ali, talks about a trickster, about a category of trickster in relation to the boxer, and he makes the claim that that it was actually you can't understand Muhammad Ali and what he meant particularly for only if we were to think about the political positions he took or the statements he made, but also the very nature of how he carried out his boxing. In terms of a left-wing politics, another productive example, I think, is from Argentina. In late 60s, following the strikes in Rosario, there was a movement of actually trying to interpret whatever occupational praxis that you were involved in, and this translated to football coaches who thought of a left-wing way of playing football, and who wanted to think with how athletes actually could not merely just think and run, but run while thinking and not think without running. So just to sort of again go back and trying to, because I think like the two major things that I'm trying to first of all say is that with James, we can think about pushing against, understanding of sport merely as rest and recuperation. I mean, this is what even Marcuse writes in One Dimensional Man, of thinking about sport, and which is just recuperation from work, but actually it becomes a creative practice and meaningful practice on its own. But why does it become that meaningful practice is because sports persons are interpreting it not merely as just a skill-based endeavor, but also there are political ideas that come into it. And this kind of work, and then, like, obviously I moved towards one of the most interesting characters in Indian cricket, which is Mohammad Azharuddin, and I was keen to understand that there was a special appeal to him, and why that is so, and whether I could answer both of the concern that James raises about how we can disrupt these aesthetic notions of high and low art, but also whether there's a creative sort of meaningfulness to his praxis. So just to give for those who are not aware about Azharuddin was this Indian captain throughout the 90s, the men's cricket team captain. But before that, when he arrived on the cricket field, one of the things that that really made him stand out was the way he would go about playing the game. And it was not merely a question of interpreting its grammar, but also breaking it. This is I mean, if you're not familiar with cricket, this is much harder to understand. And I think, like, this is something that I would share with a lot of people who've written with Azhar as well. It was very hard to put into words what he was doing, but but essentially he was really destroying the rules of the manual of the game itself, by the way he would approach the game. And this actually became a stick to beat him with as his career progressed, because cricket itself was undergoing a change. Cricket was becoming, with huge corporate investment and with money coming into the game, there was expectation of players to play in this professional manner, which usually it translates into cutting out the flair and actually just contributing to the team's interest and controlling your own instinctual play. But Azharuddin throughout his career refused to do that. So to make sense of that as a theoretical category, I came to the category of shock, particularly as Walter Benjamin uses when discussing text on Charles Baudelaire. And I see multiple sort of dimensions or aspects of the category of shock when I started studying Azhar. One of them for me particularly was this notion, and this notion which also comes up in James's writing, of disciplined spontaneity, which Azhar was playing fast and loose with. And he would literally shock you by the manner which he approached the sport. And he was, and as he grew older, he became even more wedded to his own style of play, refusing to bow to the sort of the diktats of commentators and critics who would expect him to produce this rationalized, to pursue this sort of rationalized way of playing the game. But the other aspects of shock was obviously the fact that he was the Indian men's team captain in the time of the rise of Hindu nationalism throughout the 90s. In fact, there were 3 cricket World Cups tournaments, and he remained the captain, even as in the sort of wider in the society around the game, things changed. And in fact, there was an interesting poster around the destruction when the Babri mosque there was destroyed in 1992. A lot of Indian cricketers, which is in contrast to the positions they take now, they actually advocated secularism. And this is the kind of so in a way, the fact that he could be that a Muslim man could lead the Indian men's cricket team, and cricket is obviously the most popular sport in India, that in itself had shock value. But the third sort of most important, and I guess like where Azharuddin would invite the disdain of CLR James, because CLR James would write quite openly against gambling in sport, and Azharuddin's career finished because he fixed or threw matches towards the end of his career, and that was the end of it. And I actually, that was in a way my starting point into thinking about why Azhar is important, because he is raising some, because through that act, in which he acted selfishly, uh, you know cricket has undergone multiple episodes of match fixing, and usually it has ended in one or two cricketers who are in senses the big fishes, being demonized and then being banned from the sport without cricket actually looking at why that is. And I was thinking of Frantz Fanon's disdain of sport, particularly in which he's pushing against the commodified notion of sport that you actually, and I would like to quote here. um, so Fanon writes that in Pitfalls of National Consciousness, that sport should not be a pastime or a distraction for the bourgeoisie of the towns. The greatest task is to understand at each moment what is happening in our country. We ought not to cultivate the exceptional or seek a hero who is another form of leader. We ought to uplift the people. We must develop their brains, fill them with ideas, change them, and make them human beings. And I think it is at this point which serves for me as a point of departure for thinking about Azharuddin particularly, because this remained at the center of the Jamesian sort of project, the way he would understand cricket. He would understand it in a way of focusing on individuals who would, symbolize the energies of the time as centripetal objects. But I do think that James was not merely thinking about individual leaders. He was placing them in relationship with their team, and there was more to it. And yet I think that therein maybe lies the project of understanding sport, aesthetics, and Marxism, where we actually start thinking with James, with what Fanon says. And this paper, is keen to particularly push for the kind of ideas that came out of, like I earlier said, from Argentina, or about there being a left-wing way of playing sport. And I think that in itself is a gap. But just to sort of give another, shed light on how I actually think about what that project might look like. Because generally Marxists, when they've studied sport, they have thought about it as work, and they've conceived the sport as a capitalist enterprise where workers are condemned to exist as alienated subjects. But when we start thinking about someone like Azharuddin, and how he embodied the dialectical motion of in terms of the category of shock, we can actually see that shock is not merely as it works as a numbing factor, but it can also jar you towards action. And in that sense, he is an exceptional figure. But I don't think the limits of this project are sort of limited to Azharuddin particularly. So Azharuddin becomes sort of an entry point into a wider project. Yeah, so sort of to sum up, and there are many things happening in this paper which I recognize, is that I'm really keen to flesh out the fact that there is an importance to think with James because of the disruption that he's causing in the notions of high and low art. But and also because he is pushing for an aesthetic appreciation of cricket, and I think this can extend to other sports as well. But thinking with not just the political positions that athletes take, and this has become a popular mode of analysis, especially in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, but also thinking with their praxis and what that can look like. And I think the example for me of thinking with praxis is Azhar's batting, and also not just the batting, but also the roles that he performed as a captain, and who identified as Muslim in public life, but also his dalliances with gambling or match fixing. And even though the popular accounts, and hasn't been a sustained sort of biography of the cricketer, but the popular accounts, for them the lament is the figure of what could have been with Azharuddin, because he did evoke that kind of appreciation, and the end was rather tragic in a way. But I think it's to think about sport, we don't necessarily have to just think about athletes as workers who are alienated subjects, which has been the dominant sort of direction of study in in relation to Marxism and sport. But So one could emphasize James, but there are directions for moving on, and in a way, James is almost invoked. But this famous quote by James is always shared, and I think I want to end on that, because what do they know of cricket who only cricket know, in which James is essentially suggesting uh, that it's not important to just know the game, but also what's happening outside the field, which I think is a call that has been taken up by scholars and journalists and people who write on cricket. But he's also asking for there's a double motion there in that famous statement. He's also asking for people to understand the game on its own terms, which I think is not often done in studies on sports. And I think studying the game on its own terms would mean taking that aesthetic appreciation, but thinking aesthetically as a political act, and I think that would be the way probably to go. So yeah, so those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for